Hey everybody, Merlin Silver here, and I'm going to show you a few things today behind the scenes of my new single, Sonder, that's coming out on the 30th of July on Sofa Beats Records. I thought I'd take you behind the scenes and show you my workflow for making specifically the drums in this track. So let's go and check it out. Cool, so this is the master project for my track Sonder. So yeah, having a look at this project, you can see that I kind of habitually bounce everything down to audio. All my groups, all my layers of melodic instruments. I could just solo this master group and we can hear yeah, lots of stuff going on. So generally as my projects go on, I'll start rendering things down and down and down and down, because ideally when I mix, I want to only be looking at 4, 5, 6 things, even if they're folded into groups like this. It just makes it so much easier and so much, I think, more fun to mix everything in hard audio and forget about all your MIDI and find ways to fix things. So yeah, everything's mixed down into groups. We got the melodic group, the bass by itself, all the effects, like loads of effects, and finally the drums, which is what we're going to have a look at today. So yeah, before I show you how they actually sound, I want to show you how they were supposed to sound, or where I started. So a lot of the times when I'm feeling a little bit uninspired or not very musical and I still want to do something productive, I'll sit down and make a long drum track. I'll come up with a loop and add some layers and percussion, and then I'll arrange that and maybe spend like an hour or so doing that and just save it somewhere. And the idea is when I am feeling musical and I've got a bit of a jam going on with guitars or synths or something, I can just grab one of these drum stems and just kind of throw it into the mix, and it will already be kind of interesting and have a bit of movement and tension and be much more fun than working with a 4-bar loop and just building that up. So yeah, this is what I started with, and all these melodics and bass and everything, this was arranged around these drums to begin with. And the mix that ended up was this. It's really, really different, and yeah, it took a bit of a different turn. And I think at the beginning, when I was working with this, I had this idea that this track would kind of be a bit garagey or two-step, or at least kind of really snappy and minimal, with lots of space for all the orchestration. But as I went on and on and on and just kept sound designing and putting effects on everything and playing around, the drums kind of started fading into the background, and that space wasn't there, so they didn't really have any impact. So as you can see, I tried a few things to fix that. Multi-band compression, automated a filter on and off, some delay and stuff, but it wasn't really happening. And I took a opportunity to just throw it away and start again. So yeah, the message here is don't be scared to do that. Like sometimes your idea changes as it develops and you need a different kind of rhythm section. So just start again. It's good. It's healthy. Wicked. So this is my main drum channel. This is the kick and the snare, some percussion, and I'll just play it by itself. So obviously not the most amazing, earth-shatteringly interesting drums at all, but I'm really happy with the way they fit into this, and that's the important thing. So let's have a look at the kick. And I find this happens more and more as I produce and get older and have more experience. I don't really end up EQing or compressing my kicks at all. It's just sound selection. Like, honestly, if you can just learn to follow your nose and kind of learn to define in your head what it is you want and what you think sounds good and how you want your music to sound, then what kick you should use or what snare you should use just gets more and more obvious. And eventually you kind of will just go on your gut feeling. And I think that's really good. I think, so many samples are processed anyway that you just need to choose the right ones and not think too much about destructively tweaking them. Funny thing about this one, Just a Good Kick from Mindex, who makes amazing music. I just kind of end up using this all the time, not on purpose, but when I look back, I just find that maybe 60% of my tracks have got this kick as a fundament. And yeah, if it's not broke, don't fix it. It's just the kick, and it's Psy-bass music, so it's not really the most important thing that people listen to. Works like a charm. I had a few other ideas though. This was the original kind of rewrite. Much more hip-hoppy and kind of dusty. And then after that, I tried another kick from the same Shanty Planty sample pack. Really cool kick, but it has this kind of bit crushed alias vibe that I didn't really want. So, perfect. My favourite, once again. Bit of percussion. Just a sample. Hats, just samples. So, absolutely nothing to talk about there. Snare. Really nothing interesting happening here. Again, it's all about choosing what you want it to sound like and finding that and just running with it. But in this case, something that I think is important is that I haven't put this into one-shot mode. So when I take my finger off the pad, it stops so I can control how long the snare is with MIDI. For me, that's really important because that's what drummers do with how hard and the way they hit the snare drum. So I have that option here. And what we've got is one really, really noisy kind of, just burst of white noise with a bit of a kind of resonant note in it. And then I've got this clap underneath. And you can basically not hear that in the mix, although I feel like I can. If I take it off. Yeah, in my listening environment, that's a bit more interesting with this kind of rattle going on underneath. And both of those things are just compressed like hell. Ooh, no attack, no release, really small range, threshold all the way down. And my goal with a snare drum like this is to just get this short and interesting burst of really loud noise that I can mix later on. So I'm not really looking for movement or decay or anything like that. I want this kind of slab of noise, and the compressor helps me get that, of course. And if we find a snare drum here, and if I zoom in and say how long is that in milliseconds, at the bottom of my screen, you can see that's 142 milliseconds. And for me, somewhere between 100 and 200 milliseconds is going to give me that loudness that I want, that kind of perceived loudness over time that I can then mix with later. If it's shorter than that, I'll have to compress it later and then it will get longer because the tail becomes part of the transient. Or if it's longer than that, it will be too loud and too banging and I'll have to gate it or do something else. But yeah, between 100 and 200 milliseconds for me gives me the kind of loudness that I want to mix with later on. So yeah, snare compressed to hell. Let's have a look at the... oh no, before we go on, I've got a reverb and delay that gets turned on occasionally. And if you zoom out to my arrangement, you can see it kind of happens at fairly odd times. So it's not like the same thing happening every bar. They don't even happen on the same hit a lot of the times. So I like kind of getting a bit random or just maybe being intentional or maybe just copying and pasting weird groups of bars, like 7 bars long or something. And yeah, for me, that just adds a bit of interest and detail before I even put other layers on. Sweet. So all of these drums are compressed very, very hard in parallel. So we still get a bit of the original through. I'll just turn this glue compressor off. And on again. And that lack of dynamic range that we hear with it on really seems to push it forward in the mix, just like a step, and makes it nice and present. So in compressing things, even though it's in parallel, I've kind of squashed the dynamic range, if you know what a compressor does, and make the peak and the tail closer in volume. And then after that, I like to do the kind of opposite, or not really the opposite, but something different, and work here with an expander. I could have used Ableton's expander, but I went with FabFilter because it's just so pretty, and maybe I was going to do something a bit more intricate and just thought, nah, that sounds fine as it is. So what's happening here is it's temporarily boosting the peaks when they cross over the threshold here. And they're doing it really quickly with no attack, medium release. And that's just after I've squashed it with the compressor, boosting back up the squashed transients so they have a bit more detail in them when you hear them. Let's turn it off and turn it on again. So in this instance, really it's just the snare that's kind of popping through. But if I turn both of these off, yes, nice and meaty, bit more gain, lots more loudness, happy days. Here I've used a compressor as a kind of transition tool. If I have a look at what's going on here, I've just used this in some of the breakdowns to quieten down the drums. And I've also, in these sections, used this kind of weird EQ to get a telephony kind of lo-fi sound. And I've also used a multi-band compressor in parallel with some automation on the outputs of the high and the mid and the low. And that's just a really nice way, I think, I do it here as well, of kind of fading things out without it being too obvious, like you would have with a filter. Just taking a bit of the sparkle and a bit of the sub away without it being dramatic. I think it works really nicely. So yeah, that's the drums, and there's not terribly much more to say about that, except make the right choices, focus on your library, spend time on it, and eventually you'll just kind of be able to trust your gut and won't overthink this. So here's the top loop. All I did here was program a bunch of samples in different layers. We can hear some tablas and like a ride cymbal and a kind of 808 kind of sizzle thing happening. And then I EQ'd them as a group and bounced them out. I think I also did a bit of orchestration, fading out here and things turning on and off. But essentially, I had a bunch of loops that I made and processed them together, and then bounced that down to a long track once again, so I don't have to look at all these layers and go crazy. So finally, I've got a percussion group here, and this is pretty fruity. Let's have a listen. And yeah, so lots happening here, and this is really, really processed. Well, this one that we just heard is kind of dry and high-pitched. This is very mid-range and really, really full of processing. And so in this case, I had an acoustic drum kit doing the same pattern as my main drums. I think I used Addictive Drums for that. And then I just squashed the hell out of it. Probably with FabFilter's compressor, or maybe Live's glue compressor, and duplicated that a few times. So we have this lovely kind of over-the-top snare that when I mix it with the drum rack up here, like that kind of tail really adds something to the mix. We also have this kind of note, this pitched element at the beginning, which kind of, yeah, sets the scene nicely. And lots of kind of clinky, clanky sound design stuff I probably recorded in my tool shed and put into a sampler. And here we can hear lots of kind of tonal tom-toms and fills, and I used Ableton's new spectral resonator for that came out in Live 11 to get this kind of robotic, almost Daft Punk drum sound. So finally, cymbal, nothing really to talk about that. I've boosted the highs, and then I've kind of given the sides more volume than the mids, so it's a bit more stereo-y, and that works. I mean, it's a cymbal. So altogether, I haven't really done much on the bus, and even though I think it all sounds quite chunky, and the reason is because I've put so much processing on these layers here, and then I've bounced them out. So this is actually more complicated than it looks. But at the end of the day, I've just added a little bit of compression. And this is really fast, so it's just taking away the transients, squashing them down a little bit more to help me mix and master later. This is just taking some gain away, and the EQ here is just going to shelf off or carve out a little bit of the high end that I thought was a bit kind of overly present and resonant. I'll just turn this off. And it's kind of clangy, and then I turn it on. Especially those snares, they don't really kind of rattle as much. So that's really, really subtle, of course, but I think it's these details that really, really add up to the whole track. So if I just mix in the bass and the effects, we can hear that once everything else is in the mix, then the drums kind of aren't the most important thing, but they really support the rest of the sound design. Cool, so that's about it. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed the track. I hope you go out and listen to it and tell your friends and their pets and save it and do all of these crazy things. But thanks for watching, and I hope you've learnt something out of digging into this track and seeing that sometimes drums can be really, really, really simple, and you just got to understand what role they're fulfilling in your track and how important they are. So that was it. I'm Merlin Silver, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.